Now please join me in welcoming Professor Wang Hui.
Thank the organizer of this event to invite me over here in honor of the Fredric Jameson. And it's really happy for me to be here for the celebration for the Holberg Prize for the Fredric Jameson. In China, we used to some kind of the words, like a diplomatic words for the good friends. Sometimes they used to describe those people like Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. But for the Chinese intellectuals, the Fredric Jameson was really old friend. Not only the old friend, but also the comrade and the counterparts. So he had frequently visited China and involving himself the cultural debates, the intellectual debates. So he's a cultural intervention or intellectual intervention. So that's why I try to choose the title of the Jameson in China to be the theme of my presentation. Actually, the Jameson is the theorist most translated. Most of his book has been translated into Chinese. And I calculated, it's about 12 books plus the 4 volumes collection, the selection. So that's most of his works has been translated into Chinese. And all these books were broadly read, not only broadly read, but also hotly debated. And sometimes kind of the intellectual confrontation happened because of the publication of his books in Chinese. So that's it's from the very beginning when his name was known to Chinese intellectuals. Jameson came to China the first time in 1985. From September to December, he taught 4 months at the Peking University. That the theme of his lectures, series of lectures, was the postmodernism and the culture theory. So if you read the list of his publication, 1 book appeared first in Chinese rather than in English. So I know that before that he published the English the paper in New Left Review on the postmodernism in 1984. But it's in the 1985, when he was in China, he developed systematically about his theory of postmodernism. So next year, the 1986, these lectures were translated into a book in Chinese by Professor Tang Xiaobing here. So since then, we became familiar with the concepts, the vocabulary of postmodernism. So before that, of course, in the field of the architecture and sometimes they use this term, but no systematic theorization of postmodernism. That was the first time among Chinese intellectuals to talk about the postmodernism and the culture theory. So both categories of the postmodernism and the culture became very crucial concepts after that, after his visit to Peking University. So that I think it's later a lot of most of his books were published. I try to mention several, I think the books or the articles which became the hot debate, the theme for the hot debate. One is the postmodernism. Second, I think is the third world literature and the national allegory. That was translated into 1989, published in the film studies. It's quite interesting. That year, I think in the 80s China, for the theories, 2 documents, 2 texts were first published in the Journal of the Film Studies. One is an early text by Louis Althusser about ideology and the state apparatus of ideology. Later was the Fredric's paper on the third world literature. So all these terms became frequently used till now. And then the singular modernity became another hot theme for the debates. So all this is, I think, as I said, from after the end of the Cultural Revolution, many Western theories were translated into Chinese. I think his book, it's most translated, most read by the Chinese intellectuals. But what made him special, together like many other theories like Habermas, Derrida, Foucault, what made him different is his own involvement in these debates. I think this is an intellectual, direct intellectual intervention. Here, before I try to say something about, before I elaborate the arguments here, I just mention some specialities for him. I think the first, in 1985, when he came to Peking University to give the lectures on the postmodernism and the culture theory, is in the context of the post-cultural revolution context, which means that the two things I think very important. One is the recession of the Marxism as an ideology in China. So in his lectures, he talked about the postmodernism, but from a kind of the new perspective of Marxism. So itself, the fact itself became quite fresh for many intellectuals and raised a lot of the debates among the Chinese intellectuals, the theme of Marxism. Especially, on the one hand, he raised the issue of the Marxism, the Marxist analysis of the postmodernism, the historicization of the postmodernism as a phenomenon of the transnational capitalism. So that kind of, on the one hand, is a reclaim the Marxism, but in a totally different perspective. That's, I think, the fact. Second is he was somehow, because in the field of the cultural studies, or especially literary studies, at that time, most fashionable trend in the circles of the literary studies was the formalist critique, formalism. So he actually historicization, politicization of these criticism, but not simply give a negation of that formalism, but studied from analysis of form, trying to grasp historical political meaning behind that. So that methodology became very important among the Chinese intellectuals. So that's, I think, it's why at that time his talk became later, especially after the 1989, became more and more important, lead the whole trend of literary criticism on the postmodernism. The second is that he talked about the postmodernism, of course. But that in the 80s, in the mid-80s, China, among the Chinese intellectuals, there was a very strong anxiety for the absence of the modernism or high modernism in Chinese literature. We talk about the realism, romanticism. We are anxious. We were anxious for having the high modern, the modernism. Suddenly, Jameson raised the issue of postmodernism. So this, they disturbed about why he raised this issue, what's the meaning of it. And then, even more important, in his series of lectures, he gave the very famous periodization of the history of the literary history, and from within the social history, that the realism vis-a-vis the liberal capitalism, and the modernism vis-a-vis the imperial period, and then the postmodern and the transnational capitalism. Then the issue for Chinese intellectuals was that how could we have the postmodern in our stage of our developments? Because we thought that after the end of Cultural Revolution, we thought our history was backward again. No more revolutionary, but the backwards. We have the anxiety for the modernization. So that's in anxiety for the modernization, or the theory or the ideology of modernization became dominant, that Professor Jameson introduced his theory of the postmodernism. So that, I think, it's another part. So obviously, and then the third aspect was that following the whole modernization process, the whole imagination for the Chinese intellectuals was integrated into the so-called the world system, dominated by West. And suddenly, by the end of the 1989, he published articles to talk about third world literature, and a national allegory. So all these things, it sounds quite paradoxical, contradictory for us. It's new and fresh, but on the other hand, we don't know how to locate his role. And from then, that uncertain role became the very important starting point for the debates among the Chinese intellectuals. And then, after the 2000, after the September 11, after the so-called rise of Chinese economy, he came to China again to talk about the singular modernity. So to talk to one that when these kind of the slogan of rise of China, to encourage the intellectuals in China to talk about the Chineseness or the Chinese road and so on and so forth. He warned us, say, even now there was a so-called rise of China, but in a basic framework, you're even more integrated into that global capitalism. So in that way, on the one hand, by the end of the 80s, he talked about the third world literature. Now he talked about the singular modernity. All these became a kind of somehow became the theoretical elements for the politicization of intellectual discourse in contemporary China. I think that's the very important. I think I try to sketch the political implication of his role in Chinese intellectual world. And also, I think it's here I try to also say something about his theory itself and its relation to China. As I said, that the China is not only the place that a lot of his work were translated into the Chinese, but also the China somehow is a kind of integrant of his theory, integrated elements of his theory somehow. So let me talk something about the thesis of the third world literature and the national allegory, which was, I think it's if you choose one of three or two the theoretical texts were most read by the Chinese intellectuals in last decade, this is absolutely the one of them. So we know that he himself, before his visit to China, most of his studies, even he talked about the third world literature, he had a long interest in Latin America, Cuba, and so on. So only after his visit, he tried to integrate the elements or the literary tradition in China into his theory. So in that long thesis, he gave a very brilliant analysis of Lu Xun, and then Mao Dun, Lao She, all these modern Chinese writers became the objects for his readings and the close readings. That is, and then, as I said, at that time, most of Chinese writers was really eager to be the high modernist and the more individual psychoanalysis and so on and so forth. But suddenly, Professor Jameson suggests that only in the third world literature has the capacity to integrate the individual and the public, and to overcome the separation between like unconscious fields and the political and other fields. So that's it's a shock for many Chinese intellectuals. So I think it's quite interesting. And also his term itself, the third word, the term, we know that it came from Mao Zedong's discourse. If you compare the Mao's discourse on the third word and the Jameson's discourse on the Third World literature, you can find something quite interesting, similarity and differences. Mao's idea of the Third World, it originated immediately after the World War II. In 1946, he raised another term, that so-called central zone, or the central belts, which he used to describe the zone from Japan to Britain. He thought that the West would not be a totality. There was some internal conflicts between those capitalist countries and the dominant country of America. So at that time, already started from his idea of continue his idea of the United France, but not within the national struggle, but the international struggle. But at that time, he was very clear, for Mao, he tried to argue that the necessary for China to unite with the Soviet Union. It's the only way for him that because the United States will not allow China to develop a modern state independently. So, but after the 50s, especially the debates between China and the Soviet, in 1962, Mao again to raise the issue of the Central Zone. At that time, he accounted China as a part of third world countries, not the Eastern Bloc, part of the Eastern Bloc. So at that time, he said that there was two central zones. One is third world countries, another is so-called second world, the Western world. So here you can find that the Jameson's idea of third world literature, obviously he more emphasized the polarization structure because first world and the third world. It's changed, moved along. So that subtle change actually followed his own theoretical understanding of the imperialism. That's the historical territorial imperialism at that time in the early stage was mainly focused on the relationship between those suzerain imperial subjects. But now in the transnational capitalism, the crucial issue, the contradiction meant, so in terms of Mao, that the main contradiction became the dominant contradiction between the first world and the third world. So the map, historical map, transformed. And so when he talked about national allegory, third world literature, started from the category used by Mao, but actually developed in a new context, which you can trace back to his interpretation of postmodernism, so the cultural theory too. At the same time, we know that even in 1985, when he was in Peking University, he suggested the students to read the Mao's writings on the contradiction and on the practice. So that was the shock for the younger generation. Suddenly we were taught as to read these Mao's writing. We simply think that we should farewell to that tradition. So, but from that kind of only recently I tried to, in order to prepare this presentation, I tried to reread the journals at that time. I suddenly realized that why these two texts published in the cinema studies that by Althusser and by Jameson was so important, because these two texts actually interrelated somehow, because the whole idea of dominant structure came from Althusser, which was also the integrant part of the James theory, came from maybe not originated, but the new developments of the Mao theory about the contradiction as the structure. So that I think it's quite important. So the interaction between China and his theoretical practice was a very complicated way. So not only for he came to China as a theorist, many young students eagerly to study his text, but also the dialogues between these younger generation intellectuals and Jameson, and through Jameson, to have a dialogue with our own modern tradition. that can reinvent that tradition. That's why his thesis and many of his texts were hot debates in China. And also, it's sometimes that kind of the enthusiasm for his writings. Also, sometimes it became the real theoretical confrontations among the Chinese intellectuals. Not simply, sometimes, of course, the real confrontation between those people in China and the theorist himself, and then became the field, created some space for the intellectual debates. So that, I think, one of the issue itself, it's a very complicated issue, was his judgment about the 60s. I still remember that he once used the term, Mao's term, to compare China as a country like a nuclear. Suddenly, the energy released, and that's to describe the historical moment in the 60s. So, but we know that it is a bomb of the 60s in China too. But after the end of the Cultural Revolution, the dominant ideology started from, I think, from the total negation of Cultural Revolution. So how to evaluate the Mao's role in the modern Chinese history, and how to evaluate the political implication or the historical significance of the Chinese 60s was the most sensitive and the political issue. That's why his perspective, when he used these kind of the theoretical perspective and the categories to re-establish or re-elaborate the implication of the 60s in the global context, immediately ignite the confrontation or the passionate debates over these things. Because without these kind of the debates, it's almost not possible for us, for Chinese intellectuals, to understand what's the meaning of the modern Chinese Revolution and the short 20th century in China. So that's, I think, that's why I said that the whole theory, he talked about the postmodernism, historicism, the cultural theory, and the singular modernity. And all one of the function of these theoretical intervention was the repoliticization of the Chinese intellectual discourse. So that, I think, it's quite crucial for the, I think it's a time. Okay. So that's the, anyway, I would like to end here, but I would like to say something, welcome you to come to China again and to have a hot debates with us. It's, I'm honored, I was honored that when I was the editor of Dushu magazine, that we hold the roundtable discussion after the, immediately after the September 11. That's also, I still remember that even on the table, that debates continued. That's quite unusual. Thank you very much.